Fractional reserve banks do not create inflation. Legal tender, central banks, and fractional reserve banking. There's a lot of idiots out there calling themselves Austrians who argue that inflation is caused by fractional reserve banking, and fractional reserve banking is evil and not part of the free market. These people are clearly incapable of looking at the historical facts and understanding them. The United States had fractional reserve banks from at least 1800 until the Federal Reserve Bank was created in 1913. As this chart shows, there was essentially no inflation during that time period, which completely destroys the whole stupid idea that fractional reserve banking creates inflation. By the way, President Javier Milei has not eliminated fractional reserve banks and is slaying inflation in Argentina. He's also never said that fractional reserve banks create inflation. He often points out, as Milton Friedman said, inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. This is straightforward supply and demand. As the quantity of money expands, its price has to fall. Copernicus pointed this out back in 1526. We can see this is true for all inflationary periods that have ever occurred, including ancient Roman inflation that happened around 3rd century AD, and the inflation that occurred after the conquest of the New World by Spain. In the case of the Romans, they debased the denarii by reducing the silver content from like 95% to less than 3%. In the sort of opposite case, the Spanish conquest of the New World resulted in huge amount of imported silver and gold from the New World to Europe and caused huge inflation, causing prices to double or even quadruple. So this shows inflation is everywhere and always a monetary phenomenon. The most common reason for this inflation is the debasement of the currency or printing of the currency. Usually this is done by governments to pay for things that they know are politically unpopular and to avoid the political hit of raising taxes to pay for it. Government deficits are often why inflation is resorted to, but in the case of government printing or debasing coins, this would be impossible without legal tender laws. Except for the case of Spain and the New World, every inflationary period in history is associated with legal tender laws, which force people to accept a debased currency that is printed money, which people would not use unless forced to do so. The easiest way to end inflation is to get rid of legal tender laws. Many of these Austrians confuse central banks like the Federal Reserve with fractional reserve banking. The two are not the same, and the two are not tied together. Fractional reserve banking occurs in a free market. It is a free market phenomenon. Part of their confusion is that they think banks loan out the deposits that they get from savers, which is not the case. What banks do when they create a loan, that is money, backed by an asset like a house, the money is loaned out and is backed by the asset. Usually, the asset value is greater than the value of the loan. Fractional reserve banks act very much like brokers who sell bonds and stocks on exchanges. In fact, in Bitcoin and the crypto market, almost immediately, crypto fractional reserve banks were created, such as MakerDAO. Actually, their fractional reserve is 0%. So, fractional reserve banks are naturally occurring things. They're not government-imposed things. What these so-called Austrians don't seem to understand is that the currency that these banks give out for loans is backed by the assets that they use to create the loan, such as having a legal claim to the farm or the house if the borrower doesn't pay back the loan. In the case of the crypto market, they don't keep any reserve. It's also the case in corporate bonds. You give them money, but they don't keep any in reserve. They promise to pay you that money back. This promise to pay you back is all based on future earnings. So this also points out another stupidity that's often repeated. Fractional reserve banks create money out of thin air. No, they don't create money out of thin air. What they do is collateralize assets such as houses, businesses, and jewelry, or your promise to do future work, which means that their ability to create so-called money out of thin air is limited to the assets that are backing those loans. And if they overextend themselves, they go bankrupt. Now, central banks are government-enforced monopolies. and they are not a traditional bank or a fractional reserve bank, and they are evil. In the modern world, they're the ones usually issuing the currency. Of course, dishonest politicians love central banks, and central banks' ability to create money out of nothing and thus defraud people through inflation. Note that these politicians are usually Marxists or Marxists in sheep's clothing, as is the central bank. It's a Marxist institution. There's no honest, rational justification for a central bank. Not surprisingly, they were part of Marx's Communist Manifesto. Central banks are evil and Marxist institutions. But there will be fractional reserve banking in a free market, period. Fractional reserve banks are not evil, and they don't create inflation. They are not the problem. The problem ultimately lies with legal tender laws. If there weren't legal tender laws, these central banks, like the Federal Reserve, would all fail, because no one would accept their currency. Long live freedom, damn it.